Thanks also for almost keeping to time. And I'm now going to turn to the panel, who have 5 minutes each. And perhaps, Lynn, would you like to start us off? Or would Peter, would you like to start? Sure.
Thanks. Thank you, Chris. And thank you to Hewlett and ODI for setting up today on what is a really key development challenge for us going forward. I'm going to briefly reflect just on 5 things. Chris has asked us to be creative. It doesn't come naturally to a civil servant, but I'll try as best I can. I think the first thing is that I think the report is terrific, Lisbeth, and thanks to you and Desmond and others who have worked on it. And I think we would agree with the analysis and indeed the conclusions of the report. The 5 things you recommend about how to go forward, I think, are right. So we wouldn't dispute that. I think the trick comes in not the what but the how we might take that forward, and indeed the political will and institutional will to do that. Secondly, Chris, you mentioned at the beginning that this is all in the context of a very tough global economic climate, and that, of course, underscores and hangs over all of this dialogue. We, the UK, are in a fortunate position to have a rising aid budget. We've committed to spend £8.5 billion on education in the 10-year period to 2015, and we've no reason to believe that won't happen. It's clearly not the case with other donors that they will be able to increase, or indeed, in the case of some, sustain their levels of aid. So that puts that makes the challenge harder, and it puts a higher premium on being inventive, innovative, and potentially different in how we go forward. Within that, and Desmond will cover this more in his paper, we do have a specific opportunity with the US, but we need to also not throw all our eggs into that basket. It's not clear to commentators and observers in the US that the volume or the timing of an increase in US aid to basic education is going to be of the quantum to really be a game changer, particularly when you look at levels of education aid compared to health. They may reach next year $1 billion for basic education. They're currently in the health sector at over $8 billion per annum. I think raising the issue of the unique economic climate and how hard it is, to be clear, that should not dampen our ambition in this task. It should inform our strategy and tactics. And certainly for the UK, the agenda outlined by Lisbeth is going to be a big priority going forward. Thirdly, health. The report covers a little bit why has health been more successful. I think partly health have made the case better. That's certainly true, both in terms of need and both in terms of potential results of investment. And we need to do better on that in the education sector, and indeed Lisbeth's report makes that point. Secondly, I think there's a set of particular issues in the health sector, particularly around the lobbies and the support for health. As you probably know, take the US as the prime example, as by way the largest global financer in health. Of the $63 billion that Obama committed over the next 6 years to spend on health, 53 or 52 billion of that is going to HIV/AIDS. That's a massive whack, and that's because of this extraordinary strong health lobby, US and international, and the fact that AIDS is the killer from developing countries that kills in developed countries. So there is an intense lobby of support there, which is highly organised and highly effective. Even in the UK, our department receives more parliamentary attention and letters from the general public and letters from members of parliament in HIV/AIDS than in any other sector. Fourthly, we shouldn't lose sight in the debate around aid about where the financing for education is coming from. And it is, of course, predominantly from developing countries themselves. People in the audience will know, looking around at the faces better than I do, but I think it's something like 80% of resources in low-income countries. We need to shape that better than we are currently doing, and that we shouldn't lose sight of that agenda going forward. Finally, and I've just spotted, I think, colleagues from the National Audit Office in the corner, value for money and efficiency. Now, that needs to be absolutely central to how we go forward, and that applies to both, particularly to domestic resources and the instruments we have to help developing countries make better choices around value for money and efficiency, but also to external resources. As we know, both in terms of allocation particularly, but also in terms of delivery, we need to do much better on that going forward. I haven't gone into a bit more detail around specific instruments we've got, including the FTI and others, but I think we'll cover that on the back of Desmond and Lucia's presentations. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, for some very interesting and sharp points. Let me then turn to Lynn Murphy to add to those.
Since we were also here and called as a co-host here, perhaps just a word from why the Hewlett Foundation would be interested in such a topic as where we are in financing for education and where we go. I work, as many of you know, on the Quality Education in Developing Countries Initiative, which is a joint partnership between the Hewlett Foundation and the Gates Foundation. The name of our initiative kind of says where we are on the issue. We want to see more kids in school and learning. And when you start to get into a conversation about finances for education, there's a question about, are there enough resources to make sure that children are learning, that we're not just reaching the access goal. But there's also a question not just about new resources, but how you can make existing resources be better spent. So how do we actually improve existing resources, and thinking about that, aid effectiveness, essentially. And those of you who've heard me talk about our strategy know that we have one piece that we are looking at how the resources do flow through the system, so they actually are directed towards the end user, and so kids are actually learning in school. So we were looking at financing, and we support some advocacy efforts. I would say Peter just commented on the strong lobby community in health. There's a few foundations active in education, but not a lot of them funding advocacy in education. So we are partners with, for example, the Global Campaign and a few others. But there is a need to really look at where are we in the state of the field. So that was part of the interest in commissioning this paper. With that, I want to just say a few things sitting from a foundation standpoint, reflecting on some of the findings that this paper brings forth. There is a big call to think about the use of evidence in the field of education. And as I look at that, we are actually investing quite heavily, I would say, in building some evidence within the field of education, specifically around what works in classrooms to make sure that kids learn. Many of you know we're funding rigorous impact evaluations to try to just build some evidence on the how. How are these things working, and what are cost-effective ways to improve the situation? But as I reflect on the sector, I also wonder, sometimes is the current evidence that we do have being underutilized? Mm-hmm. Some of the research or some of the points that Lisbeth made, I was thinking about the reproductive health community makes the case very strongly between the case for education, for reducing, or for improving, rather, family planning efforts. And we in education, I don't think utilize research that is out there more effectively. Yeah. I also think when I reflect back on over the past several years that perhaps we forget research that already has been commissioned. I'm reminded that the Millennium Development Task Force came out with a pretty strong conclusion that said that if we really want to get all children into school, we have to think about doing it differently. And yet I haven't really seen sustained attention to thinking about doing that differently is over time. I would hazard to say we are a very humble step trying to do that, in the sense of that we're putting forth an assertion to say if you actually improve the quality of education in schools for the poorest kids, might you actually see an increase in enrollment and retention? That's one small answer to that question, but it bears repeating that we need to think about the research that's already out there that we've kind of forgotten about. I'm also reminded of the title of the evaluation that I can never remember, but it was something called the Joint External Review on Aid to Basic Education that came out in early 2000s that noted that the existing efforts to support budget support kind of was a high-risk strategy. And there have, of course, been a lot of conversations about that, and the Paris Declaration put some principles out there. But considering population growth in many of these countries, I wonder how seriously we really are thinking about some of that research. So definitely there is a call for more research, but I think we have to remember what is already out there. The other piece of the research that I would strongly say that I see missing is a lot of research on the implementation issues. So there's both making the case to get the political will, but then there's the research that's needed in the countries themselves. I think countries themselves are at a crossroads in terms of how do they move to improve the quality of education. And really, I'm asked often, well, what can we do? How do we do this? And really investing in that kind of research. The other, perhaps just very quickly, point to make is I think we really could learn from other sectors. And I am mindful that I'm sitting in a room full of people who think about education, but I will say this anyway. I think there's a need to think seriously about field building. When I look at, for example, those who've been engaged in the field of population for a very long time, there are institutions that are out there that have been thinking about these issues for 40 or 50 years. There is investment in the next generation of leadership. There is investment in a serious research agenda that is sustained over time. There is investment to look at some of the results. I think we could learn a lot, and I think we could even be thinking and talking more with the health community. And this perhaps gets to the last point of opening up both the architecture and also capturing the global stage. I was often struck in graduate school and after the fact that there are a lot of folks in economics departments and demography departments that are looking at education, but I wonder how much we're actually talking with them and thinking about them. Many of you know the Poverty Action Lab, JPAL, has done a lot of research on education, but rarely do we see them at any international meeting. So perhaps I'll come back to opening up the club when we come to Desmond's paper, but I think there are creative ways to think about doing that, and it has to be done both globally and also in country. I am often having to start from ground zero to explain that the Hewlett Foundation is not in the business of selling printers and really start to talk in the field of education of what is a philanthropic organization. So we still have some distance to go.
Thank you very much indeed, Lynn. Actually, some of the points that you were making about research were also strongly made in the recent consultation on DFID's new strategy paper, so there's quite a lot of echoes there. But look, that's a very interesting agenda. We've got a meaty paper which certainly explores in more detail than I have seen done the question of what's holding back the resource generation exercise by getting into the minds of individual donors. And it does that in a very interesting way and comes up with a slightly different agenda for explaining what those constraints are than is popularly supposed. Let me just simply open it up. We have about 20-25 minutes discussion from the floor before turning to Desmond's paper. So let me invite comment and question. There is a microphone that will be magnetised to you when you stick your... yes, over there at the back. Keith.
Thank you. I enjoyed that. I'm afraid I hadn't had the opportunity of reading the paper, so whatever I say is probably out of court. But three things. First, I'm surprised that you find people in bilateral agencies who seem to have lost faith in the power of educational investment and educational systems to transform what people can do and how they live. Nobody in this room believes that, I'm sure. I've yet to find a working, living person in a bilateral agency who isn't, in their own behaviour, a human capitalist in terms of their investment in their own children. Why is this faith suddenly lost in the public discourse? I find it very strange. I find it particularly strange because, as Lynn said, and others have observed, there is an enormous wealth of evidence on how children learn in different societies. There's an enormous wealth of evidence on the economic relationships that exist between knowledge and skill, training and so on. And of course some of that is very disappointing, and it's certainly possible to waste money. No OECD country pursues a strategy of the counterfactual, which is to minimise the quality and quantity of its basic education. Why do we allow this debate to develop in this way? Second, I'm not surprised that there are these large differences in estimates of the cost of supposedly fixing this problem. Often, of course, this relates to different definitions of the problem that's to be fixed. And you only have to imagine very briefly the difference that a change in a discount rate into the future makes to these gap calculations to know that you can easily come up with numbers that vary by 100%. So in our recent analysis for the bank in sub-Saharan Africa, at the cost of producing systems which would have GERs of 110, 100 at lower secondary and 50 at upper secondary, we come up with numbers between, for sub-Saharan Africa, 8 billion and 16 billion, depending on what you think you want to do. There isn't a single answer to that, it's obvious. Whoever is expecting simple consensus about a single number is indeed wasting their time. Lastly, from the point of view of CREATE, the consortium which I direct, I think that one of the risks that's being run that you didn't mention is indeed of too much success and not enough failure. If you say we've succeeded in reducing the number of children out of school by 40 million in the last 3 years, or whatever number you wish to come up with, so I think GMR-wise it's down to about 50 odd million from 90 million at the beginning of the decade. It looks like success, but of course 50 million children out of school is less than 5% of all children of primary school age in the world. In fact, it's probably about 3%. Doesn't sound like a big deal. Unfortunately, they're in particular places. You collapse the agenda into fragile states when in fact most children who are out of school started but didn't finish and aren't in what people often regard as a fragile state. Secondly, if you do the calculation a different way and you say how many of those children are the right age for their grade, how many of them are attending at least 80% of the time, and how many are achieving within a standard deviation even of the norm for their age and grade, then that number is about 500 million. Why don't we repeat that number?
Yeah.
Thank you, Keith. There was another hand up. Yes, please.
Nicholas Meller. I was at a parliamentary meeting just yesterday on health and the fact that we're sort of going to fail to meet most of the MDGs in health. And the question was, well, how do we bring health into education? We can't do it without actually a more explicit linkage with what's going on in education to make children aware of health issues at an earlier stage, bringing that into the kind of curriculum. So it sounds to me as though there's this kind of open door there, but the question was, you know, to what extent are we able to explicitly address these areas where you can make an investment that cuts both ways? Or from a donor's perspective, are we putting our investments into different silos so that we are unable to really explicitly say this is an investment into health and education, and you know, we're able to count it double?
Thank you. Peter Williams at the back.
Thank you, Peter Williams. I'm not sure how I'm described on the information list, but I am a Neanderthal man, but I'm not anything to do with archives, I don't think. I was at ODI between 1962 and 1966, in charge of education. I wonder whether you think that part of the problem of generating support just lies in the nature of basic education, that it is very local, dispersed, takes place in national languages very often, and when you're into the business of budget support, it's very difficult for groups in a country like this may not be true in other countries, but actually to relate. It's difficult to form school partnerships between communities with a primary school because of the nature of the exercise, whereas if you talk about tertiary education, universities and so on are powerful organisations that want links. They can't have very many of them in our country with our current policy, but I just wonder whether it is more difficult to generate from civil society the support for basic education, which is perhaps possible at other levels. One question was really about this very large figure from South-South cooperation. I'm not familiar enough with the data myself to know whether the 6 to 9 billion is taken care of in calculating the gap, whether the gap is there after that 6 to 9 billion or whether the gap is simply for DAC countries, and I'd be interested just to have that explained. Thank you.
Thank you. Keith Hinchliffe? Oh, sorry, Steve. Steve Packer.
Someone has just muttered that it's just the same whether it's Keith.
Yes.
2 points. One to do with, and I confess I haven't read the whole paper. One is to do with donors and relating donors to the sorts of global figures that are being described. It may well be that the paper disaggregates quite clearly between different types of donor, but clearly there's an enormous variation in the ability of different donors to raise sums of money that relate in any way to the global figure. Is there an argument, for example, for recognizing that there's actually a very small group of donors who are able to raise the sorts of money that might in some way increase the current spend and commitment significantly? My second point, which may be a lack of understanding, is some slight nervousness about this notion of demand. Perhaps I've misunderstood this, but is the paper actually arguing that there's a need to try and create a demand in partner countries? You're shaking your head, Lisbeth,
Well,
in
no,
which case the answer is
no. I should
but
clarify.
I would relate this to Peter's point, that unless this discussion is taking place in the context of understanding who is financing education primarily, and that is national governments, and that this is put into that context, then it's a slightly difficult path to follow. But I think I have misunderstood what you mean by demand.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah.
My name is Ronald Sibus, Oxfam Nova, and I look completely different than these two guys over here. It's only a question on the document which I have read, because we're traveling by train, so you can read the document. Is this a kind of contradiction, what I felt, that on the one hand widening the tent, which I fully understand and is necessary, but on the other hand, the effectiveness of aid delivery, and I didn't find anything on that in the paper, how to deal with both of them.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Olof Sandman from UNESCO. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I think this is a very welcome paper that we will study with great interest. I think I'll try to be a bit controversial, because I think in this forum we seem to think aid has a crucial effect on what's happening in the country level, and it can. But I think when you look at in the more global perspective, education is actually doing quite well. The two education-related MDGs are probably the two MDGs doing most likely to succeed, and besides aid, number one, which is on poverty. And we've just gone through the general conference in UNESCO, and what really worries me is that when you hear minister from the South speaking, this perspective is slightly different from the donor perspective. And I was wondering if there's any way we could sort of move the debate more into how aid can be a catalyst for what's going on at the country level, because I think in our coming from the donor perspective, we tend to see aid probably as more important than it's actually happening at the country level, except some very aid-dependent countries. And if there's any way we could sort of link the results with the aid effectiveness and the sort of aid as a catalyst for change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olaf. I think we've got time for one more from the floor. If there's, yes, please.
Chikondi Mpokosa from Oxfam. I just wanted us to think more about what he was talking about, whether it's about governments at national level doing what they're supposed to be doing, and looking at the donor's perspective. I think we need to consider that there are some issues that are promises, for example, donors made in 2000, and the promises cannot be easily broken. While the national governments are taking their part, the donors must also be seen to implement the promises that they made. And I think that is a principle that we all have to hold the donors to make sure that they are living by their word. And then looking at the progress that we have made, I think we seem to be comfortable somehow feeding 40,000 more children than we are making progress. But we know that all the other goals will be affected by what is happening in education. And the issues, for example, we know out of the numbers of the children that are out of school, 70% over are girls. And we are not even talking about that. We have even missed the fact that we wanted to get to gender parity, and we seem not to be flagging that one very strongly. I think we should be flagging issues around girls' education, and then getting to what Lynn was mentioning about doing some other things differently. There are issues like looking at water, sanitation, and hygiene in schools, which would help more girls to stay and even be able to complete an education, which we haven't been able to push as far as we would have pushed so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to hand back now to Lisbeth, but before doing so, I just want to report one additional question that's come in over the airwaves, so to speak, from Catherine Dom in Brussels, and she asks, or she wonders, whether the team thinks that the factors that are constraining and indeed enabling donors' financing of basic education would be the same as those that you found if you had focused your attention particularly on fragile states and conflict-affected countries, where, of course, the major part of the problem resides. So if you simply add that to your list of many lists of points that you have there, and respond, if you will, within 5 minutes.
Right. Thank you very much. These are really welcome comments and very constructive, and we will. I may not be able to answer every single one of them, but you can be assured that we will be looking into them as we try and finalize this report. But maybe I will give some sort of thoughts on some of the questions that were raised within the time allowed. I think one issue that came up was this issue of are people really convinced about the impact or the value of education in sort of the broader development agenda? And it kind of relates also a little bit to the question of is it true that donors are not seeing the impact of that? I mean, it's so obvious, yes. But I think what came out of the conversations is that, first of all, there was a feeling that education has become, is something that people kind of take for granted. And we in our own sort of Western sphere actually do not really know the true impact of a lack of education anymore, because we have addressed it in our own societies. And there was a feeling that, as Peter also pointed out, with respect to other sectors, like, for example, health and the AIDS agenda, there is a much greater identification with those issues. So that's, I think, a first response, I would say, in terms of are we really, is the impact, is it not appreciated? I think in addition to that, it seems that and it was also, I guess, something that Peter was alluding to, the lobby or the sort of the use of the evidence on impact seems to be used much more aggressively in other sectors. And I truly agree with what Lynn said and other people said. This evidence on the impact of education is actually out there, but are we actually using it in a significant way enough to change hearts and minds? And in particular, are we able to link this to the sort of hot issues of the day? Because education does have an impact on various issues that are currently really on the front, at the front line of the agenda. Think about climate change, think about food security, whatever. Education plays a role. And are we kind of, the question is, are we exploiting those links significantly enough to change people's minds to focus more on education? So that's sort of the first response. I think the question about the fact that the whole aid effectiveness question is also a very interesting one, and I do think this is a part of the paper actually that we can strengthen further, because we fully believe that, and that was also voiced in the conversation, that there is a scope to improve the effectiveness of existing resources. So we need to look at that. And I certainly also take the point about the promises that have been made. And that kind of goes back to the whole agenda around mutual accountability. Donors have to be held accountable. But then the problem within the education sector is who is holding donors accountable? Where is the platform that is calling donors in when they are not delivering? And I think that's where we said, what is happening in that respect? And I think, and I'd be very interested to hear from Peter on that, I have a feeling that the health sector is more effective in that respect. Their global mechanisms, their global partnerships are chaired by high-level people, and there is a more high-level attention that kind of puts donors into their place. And maybe you can refute this, but that's sort of what we kind of got out of conversations. This isn't happening currently within the structures that are coordinating things. Just quickly also on the points with respect to not forgetting that the financing mainly comes from developing countries themselves. We absolutely agree with that. It would be actually a good follow-on question. I think we really sort of concentrated our attention on the external financing side, on what are donors contributing. But obviously the whole question of what is coming from the other side is a very good one, and needs to be looked at as well. So I think that's certainly something that needs to be addressed. Finally, with respect to coming back to the effectiveness issue and the question about widening the tent as well, I think this is a really important issue which we haven't really put our heads around yet, because there are all these actors out there that are currently not included in the debate, and we feel we have to include them. There's the private donors, there's the non-DAC donors, and then there's all the DAC donors that have been having conversations forever about coordinating. So if we do want to bring in these new parties, how are we also going to include them in the discussions around effectiveness? I think currently the NGO community is not very well coordinated either, and actually bringing them into the conversations is actually an important step forward, both because we need their voice as well, but also because it would be good to bring them along in thinking about these issues. Interestingly, what came out of our conversations with the non-DAC donors, for example, in Saudi Arabia and the Arab states, they have their own coordination mechanisms, which are very well advanced and actually could potentially put the DAC donors to shame. So it's not there is no coordination happening in the DAC and the non-DAC sphere. I think that currently these mechanisms seem to be operating in parallel and somewhat differently. In the non-DAC, there's more a sort of agreement on sort of more project-based. They are in a way acting very differently from where we are now in amongst the DAC group. So this is a very good point, and I think this is a real challenge for the whole Paris endeavor, really. It's not only within education, but also broader in other sectors as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Elizabeth, for a very stimulating paper, and indeed to all of you for a stimulating discussion.